So I'm speaking with Scott Eder from Scott Eder Gallery, and he has a new show up of underground comics. And the title of the show, The Alternative Underground, Foot Soldiers and the Revolution That Forever Changed Comics. Now, Scott, let's jump right in, and maybe we could start with you telling me how the show came together.
Well, I'm good friends with Denis Kitchen, the publisher of Kitchen Sink Comics, and they publish tons and tons and tons of underground comics back in the day. And so the majority of all this art is from Denis's collection. And I've collaborated with Denis before. And when I know what I know about his collection, a lot of artists that were a big part of, well, had an important part in the underground scene, just would never really be able to get a solo show or get any kind of show, actually, at a gallery. And so this is kind of paying tribute to a lot of the artists that, you know, we're part of the scene and maybe don't get the kind of credit that other artists seem to get in the comic scene. So that's sort of the idea behind it.
So I'm imagining I'm there right with you, and you're setting up the gallery, and we're just having this conversation. Maybe there's a couple of onlookers who aren't familiar with comics, so maybe you could say a little something about the underground comics world, which was deep in the 60s, which anyone that knows about the 60s, they know it ran from the late 60s into the early 70s. How would you describe that scene?
Well, the underground comic scene was part of that whole experimental wave of art culture that was happening in the 60s. A lot of these artists they were trained formally. Some of them were self-taught, but they all knew that they had no interest in working for the mainstream publishers, and it just was something. The same way that the film business evolved at that time, you had a break from the traditional studio films, and some of the most courageous and adventurous film, music, and also comics were created at this time. Same thing with the music scene, a real break from what had been traditional music.
So before the underground and after the underground, I'll briefly state off the top of my head, before it was more conventional and maybe a young person aspired to create the next Superman or Batman or whatever, and after the underground, it was a new generation that was looking back at what the underground generation did, and that's my generation, Generation X. We were kind of in the same boat where it was still trying to gauge how to get into comics when you weren't necessarily interested, or for some reason you didn't want to do mainstream comics. You want to do your own expressionist, experimental type comics. So,
just a quick note.
Yeah.
A lot of the underground comics, their art god was Harvey Kurtzman.
Yeah.
And they loved what was being done with Mad comic books. They loved what had been done by EC Comics, the genre of horror and science fiction, and they wanted to do, you know, it was an outcrop of outcrop. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but of kind of the hippie drug culture as well, because this is adult stuff. This is for us. This is for young men and women, not for kids. It's not, you don't have an overlord standing behind you telling you to draw Superman this way or Batman or come up with the same thing. So I think that was a big part of it.
Oh, of course. That's the risk of speaking off the top of your head. Of course, it wasn't all conventional. There were the trailblazers, like the artists for Mad Magazine and such.
Yep, and that was a big thing for them. They loved that. They wanted to do satire, and they wanted to have the freedom And underground comics kind of gave them that.
Now I'm just going to rattle off some of the material that I'll have on my post, because I'll have these examples to show folks. Frank Statt, Trina Robbins, the Reverend Jeremiah Moses, Cass Serene, Jim Mitchell, Dave Dozier, Daniel Klein, Joel Beck, Robert Armstrong, Mickey Rat Comics. Does something come to mind just from my rattling that off?
You mean of why we chose those artists in particular? Or, well, some of them are important and big name artists that, in terms of the movement, that are, again, not really well known. So Joel Beck, some of his comics preceded Zap Comics. Frank Stack also. They're pioneering comic book, underground comic book artists. And, you know, a guy like Robert Crumb gets the lion's share of attention. But these people were, they were there at the birth of it. They were there and important at the very beginning of comic art. And so, once again, you know, that's sort of the statement we're making by having a show and featuring some people that, some of the artists people think are, well, they're too important to be included in this. But, you know, they're very important and at the same time largely under-recognized, certainly undervalued. And that's kind of why we're including them in the show.
Well, just to show you, I'm a disciplined interviewer. I'm going to start to wrap it up, and I want to make sure it'll be on the blog post and have all the details of how someone can make it out to the show, the dates, February 1st to March 9th, 888 Newark Avenue in New Jersey. Is there something that you'd want to say in closing to describe the show? You're talking about paying tribute to the unsung heroes.
Oh.
Would that be the main theme, or?
Yeah, absolutely, and to pioneers that aren't really well known. One of the artists featured is Grass Green. That was the artwork of Reverend Jeremiah Moses. He's the first, and basically the first African-American underground artist. And, you know, this is another kind of pioneer that we want to give attention to. We featured 3 pieces of his in the art show. But basically, it's under-recognized art. They were all contributors in important underground comic books. And they were really excited that this is a chance for the public to see it, because our gallery is located in the Mana Contemporary Arts Center, and the majority of people who come to this gallery are not comic book fans. They're fine art and art world people. So even more important is the exposure to the whole art world, not just comic book fans.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just imagine that there's such an exciting fan base, but then there's all this other readership and all these other people that would love to just be in the know on comics.
Yeah, and it's one of the great things about the location that we're in, that so many people come and see art here that have no idea that there's an original comic art, let alone underground and alternative, which is kind of always been our specialty. So that's a really big deal for me as a dealer and as an art fan, and I'm a collector as well, which is really an important distinction in what I do. I'm a big collector. I'm just a classic comic book nerd about art.
Well, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much, Scott.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Emily, for reaching out.